My son's wife told my granddaughter that our side of the family was something to be embarrassed about. She didn't say it directly. She said it at a birthday party to another woman in a voice just low enough that a 7-year-old shouldn't have been able to hear. My granddaughter heard. Children always hear. What my daughter-in-law did not know, what none of them had thought to find out in the 4 years since my son brought her home, was that the hospital foundation she had spent 2 years courting for a naming rights donation answered to a trust that answered to me. I was 71 years old when my son called me from a parking garage in Charlotte because his wife wouldn't let him call from inside the house. He said, "Mom, I need you to know something is happening and I don't know how to stop it." I said, "Tell me." He told me in pieces the way people tell things they are ashamed of, not ashamed for themselves, but ashamed that they allowed it to happen. His wife, Francine, had spent the better part of 3 years systematically separating him from everyone who had known him before she did. His college roommate, gone. His cousin Gerald, who had been his closest friend growing up, reduced to holiday texts. And me, I had gone from talking to my son every Sunday to receiving curated updates forwarded through Francine with the warmth of a press release. He said, "She told the board that you tried to interfere with her funding campaign." I was quiet for a moment. "Which board?" "Harrington Medical Center." "The foundation. She's been building toward a major gift campaign for the cardiac wing. She told them you called one of the trustees and tried to discredit her." "Did she say why I would do that?" "She said you've never supported her career, that you've undermined her since the beginning." He paused. "Mom, I didn't know what to say. I sat there and I didn't say anything, and I've been sick about it for 2 weeks. I asked him if Francine knew he was calling me. He said no. I told him I would handle it and that he should go back inside and behave exactly as he had been behaving and not change a single thing. He asked me what I was going to do. I told him I would let him know when it was done. I want to be honest about something. I had seen this coming for longer than I had been willing to admit to myself. I had been a healthcare administrator for 34 years. I spent the last 18 of those as the chief executive of a regional hospital network in the Carolinas. I retired at 63 and spent the following 8 years doing what people who spent decades not having time to do things finally do. I read, I traveled, I served on boards. I put money into things I believed in, quietly, through a foundation I had established in my late 40s called the Whitfield Trust, named for my mother. The Whitfield Trust had, over 22 years, funded nursing scholarship programs, rural clinic infrastructure, a pediatric palliative care unit, and, among other things, a substantial endowment at Harrington Medical Center, one that predated Francine's involvement with that institution by 12 years. I had never made this public. I did not believe in announcing generosity. My mother had taught me that you give because it matters, not because you want credit for mattering. Francine did not know this. She had done her research on me. I was certain of that. She was a development director, which is the professional term for a person whose job is to understand who has money and how to access it. She knew I was comfortable. She did not know the specific shape of what I had built. That shape was not visible to people who looked at the surface. When my son told me she was going after the cardiac wing naming rights at Harrington, I had said nothing. I had filed it away. I had waited to see what kind of person she would continue to reveal herself to be. By the time he called me from the parking garage, I had been watching for 14 months. I called my attorney the following morning. Her name is Bet, and she has been practicing trust and estate law in Charlotte for 30 years. She is the kind of woman who speaks slowly because she is always 3 steps ahead and does not want to arrive before you do. I told her what my son had told me. I told her what I already knew. I asked her to compile a full accounting of the Whitfield Trust's relationship with Harrington Medical Center and to prepare a document that could be presented formally if it came to that. Bet said, "How long have we been waiting for this?" I said, "How long have we been waiting for this?" I said, 14 months. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I'll have the summary on your desk by Thursday. I did not tell my son any of this. He had enough weight on him. The situation became clearer to me over the following 10 days. Francine had not just told the Harrington board that I had interfered. She had built a case. She had submitted what she described as documentation of a pattern of behavior, emails she claimed I had sent to trustees, a letter to the foundation's executive director, a record of phone calls, my name attached to communications I had never written. My former assistant, a woman I had worked with for 11 years before my retirement, reached out to tell me she had been contacted and asked to speak about my professional conduct. She had declined and called me immediately. I had not built a 34-year career by being the kind of person who responds to action before I understand its full shape. But I had also not built it by being passive. I made 2 calls. The first was to a woman named Sylvia Tran, who had served on the Harrington Foundation board for 9 years and who I had known since we sat on a hospital accreditation committee together in 2009. Sylvia was direct in the way that people who have spent decades in nonprofit governance tend to be direct. She did not have patience for subtext, and she returned calls within the hour. I told her I had become aware of certain claims being made in connection with the Foundation's cardiac campaign. I told her I had documentation I wanted to share privately before anything became formal. She said she would meet me for coffee the following Tuesday. The second call was to a man named Robert Ashby. Robert was a former CFO of a healthcare network in Raleigh who had been quietly let go 4 years earlier. The circumstances had never been fully explained publicly. What I knew, because I'd been in the industry and in the rooms where these conversations happened, was that Robert had raised concerns internally about a financial irregularity in a capital campaign and had been removed for it. The irregularity had involved a development director. That development director had been Francine. I had learned this 11 months ago from a former colleague who mentioned it in passing at a dinner, the way people mention things they assume everyone already knows. I had not assumed everyone knew. I had gone home and made notes. Robert answered on the second ring. I introduced myself and told him I was calling because I believed we had a shared acquaintance and possibly a shared concern. He went quiet in the way people go quiet when they have been waiting for a conversation to happen, but had stopped expecting it would. He said, I wondered if someone would call eventually. He drove to Charlotte the following Saturday. We sat in my study. He told me what had happened in Raleigh. The fundraising numbers had looked right on the surface. He had found the irregularity by accident, a vendor payment that didn't match a corresponding grant record. When he pulled the thread, he found $180,000 moved across an 18-month period into an account that existed in the campaign records, but not in the audited financials. He had brought it to the board chair. Within 3 weeks, he was presented with a separation agreement. The language in the agreement was standard. The timing was not coincidental. He had signed because he had 2 children in college and a mortgage and no guarantee that what he'd found was solid enough to withstand the legal fight it would take to use it. He had never stopped regretting it. I asked him if he still had the documentation. He looked at me for a long moment. I kept everything, he said. I told him what I needed. He nodded before I finished the sentence. The Harrington Medical Center Founders Gala was held every November at the Ballantine Hotel in South Charlotte. It was a formal affair, tables at $10,000 each, the kind of event where the auction items were things like private medical consultations and weekends at donated beach houses. The foundation had hosted it for 17 years. It was the anchor event of their annual campaign calendar, and this year the centerpiece was the announcement of the cardiac wing naming gift. Francine had spent 2 years preparing for that announcement. I RSVP'd for 3. In the 9 days between Robert's visit and the gala, things happened that were not visible unless you knew where to look. The Whitfield Trust had contributed $4.2 million to Harrington Medical Center over 22 years. That giving history was a matter of foundation record. It had never been connected to me publicly because the trust operated under its own name. Bet filed a formal request with the Foundation's board chair for a meeting to discuss a significant prospective gift, one that would require a review of the Foundation's current governance and stewardship practices before the trust could proceed. This was not unusual. Major donors request governance reviews. The board chair, who had known of the Whitfield Trust for years as an institutional donor and had no idea it was mine, responded within 24 hours. The meeting was scheduled for the Thursday before the gala. At that meeting, Bet presented the Trust's giving history and introduced me, in my capacity as the Trust's founder, for the first time formally to the board. The board chair looked at me across the table with the expression of someone rapidly reassembling something. Bet then presented a separate document, a summary of the irregularities Robert had found in Raleigh, cross-referenced with a pattern analysis of certain transactions in Harrington's current campaign financials that our forensic accountant had flagged during the governance review. The Foundation's own auditors had not caught them because they were structured to look like timing differences. A forensic eye saw them differently. The board chair excused herself for 45 minutes. When she returned, she had the Foundation's legal counsel with her. I will not pretend that the days between that Thursday and the night of the gala were simple. They were not. There were calls. There were lawyers on both sides. There was a conversation with my son that I had been building toward for 9 days and that I had been building toward in a quieter way for much longer. I called him on a Wednesday evening. I told him everything. Not a version of it, not a managed summary. Everything. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "She told me you were jealous of her work, that you couldn't accept that she was successful." I let that sit for a moment. "Do you believe that?" Another silence, longer this time. I think I was told it so many times I stopped questioning it. He said some other things that I won't repeat here because they belong to him and not to the story. What I will say is that by the end of that call, he was no longer speaking in the careful, flattened voice he had been using with me for 3 years. He sounded, for the first time since I could remember, like himself. The night of the gala, the Ballantine was exactly what it always was. Beautiful in the specific way that expensive Charlotte fundraising events are beautiful. A great deal of flowers and lighting and the low, steady hum of people who have attended enough of these evenings to find them professionally comfortable. I wore a black dress I had owned for 12 years, simple enough that it required no commentary. My mother's ring on my right hand, which I have worn every day since she passed. Sylvia walked in with me. Robert sat at our table. Francine was near the centerpiece display when we entered, speaking to a woman I recognized from the campaign committee. She was in a deep green gown, confident in the way that people are confident when they believe the evening belongs to them. She had been building toward this night for 2 years. She saw me from across the room. Her expression shifted in a way that she controlled quickly, but not quickly enough. She had not expected me here. She had, I suspected, expected my name to be quietly toxic in this room by now. The meddling, difficult mother-in-law who couldn't accept her son's wife and had tried to undermine her work. She would learn something about what I had or had not done. My son was not at the gala. I had asked him not to come. He understood why. The program began at 7:30. Remarks about Harrington's place in Charlotte's healthcare community, about legacy, about the particular value of institutions that are willing to invest in the future. The kind of language I had heard at 100 of these evenings, and that was no less true for being familiar. Then the board chair stood to make the naming gift announcement. She was a composed woman, Patricia Deering, 20 years on the Harrington board, steady in all the ways that good board leadership requires. I had come to respect her in the 10 days I had known her. She stood at the lectern and looked at the room and said that before she made the announcement they had all come to hear, she needed to share something with the Harrington family. The room shifted. People at these events know when a script has changed. She said that the Foundation had become aware of concerns regarding certain transactions in the cardiac campaign that required a governance review. She said the review had been initiated by the Foundation's leadership in response to documentation brought forward by a long-time institutional donor. She said the evening's naming gift announcement was being postponed, pending the completion of that review. She did not say Francine's name. She did not need to. A development director stands at the center of a campaign. When a campaign is paused for financial irregularities, everyone in that room who has spent time in non-profit governance knows exactly who is at the center. Francine had gone still at her table. Patricia then said that she wanted to take a moment to acknowledge the donor who had made this review possible. She looked at me. She said, "The Whitfield Trust has been a partner to this institution for 22 years. Tonight we learned for the first time who is behind that trust. I want to thank her personally." I stood. I did not go to the stage. I simply stood at my table, which was enough. Sylvia stood beside me. Robert stood beside her. The room was very quiet. I said in a voice that carried without being raised, "My name is Beatrice Whitfield. I ran Harrington's parent network for the first 6 years of this institution's regional expansion. I have given to this foundation for 22 years because I believe in what it does and in the people who have given their careers to it. What I cannot support is the use of an institution I care about as a vehicle for someone's personal ambition at the expense of its integrity." I looked at Francine across the room. "The documentation has already been provided to the Foundation's board. It has been provided to the North Carolina Attorney General's Charitable Trust Division, and it has been provided to the Charlotte Observer's investigative desk." I paused. "I hope the cardiac wing is built. I intend to see that it is, but it will be built on a foundation that deserves to carry it." I sat down. Francine left the table. I watched her go. She moved through the room with the particular speed of someone who is calculating what comes next before the current moment has finished. 2 members of the Foundation's legal team followed at a discreet distance. The evening continued. These evenings always continue because the people in them understand that the institution matters beyond any single person in the room. There was champagne, and there was an auction, and there were conversations I was part of, and conversations I let happen without me. At 9:30, Sylvia touched my arm and said, "Are you ready to go?" I was. The days that followed were what those days always are. The visible work and the invisible work running simultaneously. The AG's office opened a review. The Foundation placed the cardiac campaign in a formal governance hold. A forensic audit was announced. Francine retained an attorney. That was expected. What was less expected, or perhaps more expected, depending on how long you had been paying attention, was a call I received from a woman named Dawn, who had worked in development at a hospital system in Greensboro 3 years before Francine moved to Charlotte. She had seen a mention of the Foundation story in a regional healthcare newsletter. These things travel fast in a small professional world. And she called me because, she said, she had spent 3 years being told by her former colleagues that what had happened to her was her own fault. She had the same story, a capital campaign, a pattern of financial discrepancies she had flagged, a sudden reassignment to a lesser role, framed as a performance issue. She had been too junior at the time to fight it. She had moved on and told herself it was something she needed to put behind her. I told her it was not behind her anymore if she didn't want it to be. She didn't want it to be. 6 weeks after the gala, I was sitting in the sunroom of my house in Myers Park on a Tuesday afternoon when my son came over for lunch. This had become something we did now, a thing we were rebuilding into a habit. He brought sandwiches from a place he had liked since college. He set them on the kitchen table and we sat across from each other, the way we had sat across from each other 1,000 times. He said, "I spoke to Gerald last week." Gerald, his cousin, the one who had been reduced to holiday texts. How was that? Awkward at first, then it wasn't. He picked up his sandwich. He said he'd been waiting for me to call for 2 years. I didn't say anything for a moment. "People wait," I said finally. "When they love you, they wait." He looked at me. "I know I lost time." You didn't lose me, I said. That's the part that matters. He nodded. He didn't say anything else about it, and neither did I, because some things have already been said by the time words arrive, and you both know it. The cardiac wing campaign was restarted 4 months later under new development leadership. The Whitfield Trust made a 7-figure commitment in the first round of the new campaign. My name went on nothing. That was not the point, and had never been the point. Dawn joined a healthcare advocacy organization in Greensboro and became one of its board members. She sent me a note when it was announced, just 2 lines, and I have it in the drawer in my study, where I keep things I want to be able to find. The legal proceedings move the way legal proceedings move, which is not quickly and not cleanly and not in ways that make for satisfying storytelling. But they moved. By the time I'm writing this, 3 separate financial reviews have identified transactions that should not exist. Those reviews are in the hands of people whose job it is to determine what happens next. I drove to Freedom Park on the first warm Saturday of March. I walked the path around the pond the way I used to walk it when my son was small, when he was young enough to throw things into the water and laugh at the splash. There were dogs and runners and 2 older men playing chess at one of the stone tables near the pavilion. The light in the morning in that park in early March is a particular kind of light, thin and new, not quite warm but promising. I sat on a bench near the water for a while. I thought about what it cost to wait, not the cost of patience, which is something different, the cost of watching a pattern develop and choosing not to interrupt it before it had completed itself, because you know from experience that an interrupted pattern can be explained away, denied, reframed. A completed pattern cannot. I thought about my son's voice on the phone from that parking garage, how carefully he had been speaking, measuring each word, the specific compression of a person who has been living with the anxiety of being wrong for so long that it has started to feel normal. I had heard that compression in other voices. I had sat across from women in this city and in other cities who were living inside that same careful silence. I had understood what it was, and I had not always known what to do with the understanding. I know more now. There are people in your life who are managing themselves very carefully in ways they didn't used to, who have gotten quieter about their families, who have stopped talking about old friends, who apologize in ways that don't quite match anything they did wrong, who tell you they're fine in a tone that is technically fine but is also something else. I am not a counselor. I am not here to tell anyone what to do. What I will say is that I spent 14 months watching and documenting and waiting because I knew that moving too early would only make things harder for my son. I do not recommend waiting that long. I had specific reasons for the specific timeline I used. Most people should not wait that long. Most people should reach out sooner, to a family member, to a trusted friend, to a professional who understands these situations. There are resources. The National Domestic Violence Hotline is available around the clock at 1-800-799-7233. If something in what I have described sounds like something you are living, please do not assume you have to build your own case or find your own leverage before you can ask for help. You do not. The thing I understand now, sitting in that park, watching the water, is that the point was never the leverage. The leverage was the means. The point was my son having lunch with his cousin again on a Tuesday. The point was a woman named Dawn sitting on a board in Greensboro. The point was a foundation that would build something real. I drove home. I made coffee. I sat at my kitchen table with the morning light coming through the window over the sink, the same window I have looked out of for 23 years, and I let myself feel that things were in this moment as they should be. That does not happen often. When it does, you stay there for a while. If this story reached you, share it with someone who might need to hear it. There is more where this came from. This is royal revenge. We don't just outlast them. We outlast them and we build something better in the space they thought they owned. I have been thinking about what it actually means to be ready for something, not prepared in the way we prepare for meetings or surgeries or storms, the checklist kind of ready. I mean the other kind, the kind where you have done enough living to understand that certain things, once they start moving, will complete themselves. And your job is not to panic them into a different shape. Your job is to stay clear and stay patient and make sure you are positioned when the moment arrives. I was not born knowing how to do that. I learned it the way most things worth knowing get learned, by doing the opposite first and paying the price for it. When I was in my 40s, early in my career, I responded to a threat at work the way most people respond to threats. I moved fast. I was loud about it. I made sure everyone knew I was not going to tolerate what was happening, and I won that particular fight technically. But I made an enemy I didn't need to make, and I spent 3 years managing the fallout from that one impatient decision. I won the argument and complicated everything around it. I have thought about that often in the years since. What I did with Francine was the opposite. 14 months of watching, of documenting, of letting her complete the pattern she had already started. There is nothing passive about that kind of waiting. It is, in some ways, the harder thing, because every week that passed was another week. My son was living inside a story she was writing about him. Every week I stayed quiet. He got a little more of her version of himself. That cost something. I want to be honest that it costs something. But here is what I have come to understand. A person who operates the way Francine operated cannot stop themselves. That is the nature of a pattern. It needs to run. If I'd moved in month 2, she would have reframed it, repositioned it, made me the story instead of her actions. The board would have seen a difficult mother-in-law interfering with a professional woman's work. That narrative was already prepared. I could feel it being prepared. So I waited until the pattern was complete enough that no narrative could contain it. What she did to Robert in Raleigh, she did to my son in Charlotte. She had done to someone in Greensboro before either of them. That is not a mistake. That is a method. And a method, documented across time and across people, is something that a well-written legal argument cannot dismiss. Integrity is not a single decision. It is a long accumulation of small ones, made when no one is watching, made when it would be easier to look the other way. I had spent 34 years making those decisions in hospital boardrooms and budget meetings and late conversations with people who were trying to do good work in difficult systems. That accumulation was the thing Francine could not research, could not predict, and ultimately could not outmaneuver. Sylvia stood up because she had known me for 15 years and knew what my word meant. Robert drove to Charlotte because someone had finally called him and he had been waiting to be called. Dawn reached out because she recognized something true in what she read, and she was tired of being told the true thing was a lie. None of that happens without the long record. None of it happens without the kind of character that gets built slowly, in private, over decades. My son is having lunch with his cousin again. That is what I think about when I think about whether it was worth it. It was worth it.